All right, this is Andrew Steck from Hearing is Healing Christian Counseling. Back again. This is the third video on using listening and Christian listening skills as, just as that as a resource or as a skill for mental health, and using that in the context of the biopsychosocial spiritual approach to care. And so where we left off last, we were looking at Mark Verkler's 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice and how that can be used as a skill. And then this last video, we'll look at Carl Lehman's approach, which is the Emmanuel approach. And we'll also look at some cognitive behavioral therapy, how you can use listening in general with CBT. So let's pick it up looking at the Emmanuel approach and what the Emmanuel approach is. So to introduce the Emmanuel approach, we need to talk just a second about Carl Lehman. So Carl Lehman is a medical doctor. He's a psychiatrist who, as a med prescribing psychiatrist, he also does therapy from his writings. That's apparent. And he was trained in EMDR, so eye movement desensitization, reprocessing. As you read his story, that's something that he was trained in, and then after that, he learned some other Christian inner healing prayer approaches. Specifically, he learned theophostic, and he talks about in his writing. He has his own website, so some of this is coming from that and the articles I've read there. But he talks about how that was a lot more for him in his experience. He got more resolution with that than EMDR. And then as he developed that approach, he came upon, so he has a group that he works with, and they came upon, if they switch the order. So when you're dealing with trauma, we know that basically any approach or therapeutic modality that is helpful for PTSD and for trauma, there's going to be an exposure piece of it where you're actually going into the memory. So imaginal exposure, where you're going into the memory itself where the trauma happened. And so EMDR uses that. The approach that he was using, the Christian inner healing, specifically theophostic that he was using, does the same thing. But what he found is if you switch the order around, he got more resolution. And it was a lot less concerning, or that's not the right word. It was a lot less distressing for the participant or the client who he was with. Is if you started with the good place of getting connected with Jesus, and then you went into the trauma, got the trauma resolved, then that worked a lot better. So that's the Emmanuel approach for trauma. But in the midst of that, they developed just the Emmanuel approach, or he and the team he works with developed the Emmanuel approach just for life. And he tells stories where there's times where being with a patient or a client and talking to Jesus, again, that we're going to talk to him in a good place before we go to the bad place. And some of the things that Jesus would say is, this is the goal of life. Just being here with me, having this two-way conversation where it feels true that I'm for you and I care for you. Like all of that, like that is the point of life. So, and I'll pause here and say that as a therapist, when I'm working with clients, I hear oftentimes, without them ever knowing that backstory, Jesus saying those same things, or as they have homework where they're connecting with Jesus and writing out what he's saying, those same things of that's really the point of life. So a big piece, and we're going to go back a slide here. If I can get this working. A big piece for him is the safety nets. And so with EMDR, which is, again, an evidence-based approach that personally I use it all the time as a therapist, works great for resolving trauma. But within EMDR, there's a safe place. You start with a positive or a safe place prior to going to the negative place. So I'm going to skip over some of this and just say that there's some similarity there, that you're developing safety nets with that approach for trauma. So today in this presentation, we're going to talk about a little bit less about using the Emmanuel approach for trauma, and just looking at the Emmanuel approach for life, just connecting with Jesus, hearing from him, as knowing the one who created the brain will tell people that's the point of life, is just connecting. And very helpful for, especially for anxiety and trauma and depression. Great tool. So let's do a summary of the Emmanuel approach. And I'm really not sure that this is in this is my summary as I have read his work, how I put this in working with people. That's a good way to say it. So the first part is we identify a past positive memory. And then after that, we're going to give, so this is so simple, this approach, that I can actually explain it to someone in 5 minutes in my office, and just jump right into it and have them do it. It happens so fast. It's such an easy thing to do. So we identify a past positive memory, and then we are just going to thank God for it. And then we're going to explicitly request that we can reconnect with Jesus. So, Jesus, would you connect with me here again? And then we just speak out whatever comes to our awareness. That's the whole approach right there. And it is a extremely powerful approach. Extremely powerful way of having, again, that two-way connection. Going back to the video before this, very similar to, how Mark Verkler's system and his keys, how that helps you hear from the Lord. So important to say over and over again. All these is a method to connect with Jesus, who is the mediator to connect us with God. So it's not that techniques bring us to God. Jesus, his blood on the cross, brings us to God. But here are some things that we have found that are helpful. And Carl doesn't talk about this. Dr. Lehman doesn't talk about this that I've seen, but I think about the scriptural support of this, because we're going to use a past positive memory. And so there's the story where Jesus tells the disciples to be aware of the leaven or the bread of the Pharisees and Herod. And it says there that they reason among themselves, that they're like, hey, we didn't bring bread. And Jesus says something like, hey, are you so slow to understand? And then he starts talking about positive memories. And he goes through both miracles, that they were part of the miracle of multiplying this bread. Jesus is multiplying the bread. Was it Jesus where it multiplied when Jesus divided it? Or was it when they were handing it out? Somewhere in the midst of that, they fed 5,000 people, right? Like there's two different accounts. And he asked them both, like, in this memory, when this happened, how much leftovers did you have? So there's some scriptural support in there of if I want to connect with the Lord, or I'm lacking, like they were lacking faith, they were lacking that thing to help them to connect with who God is and his goodness in the moment. And so remembering a past positive memory is an important piece of that. So I would really encourage everyone to check out Carl's work again. So emmanuelapproach.com. There is some of I think the first chapter is still on there for free. And then his book is very, very lengthy. So he is a psychiatrist. So he goes through like a lot of like the brain science of what's going on. Again, I found the power of this is just keeping it really simple and just not explaining as much and helping people just jump right in. But there's two different types of memories that we can use to connect with the Lord. The first one is a connection memory. So this is a memory of the past where we've encountered God. And so it's a memory where it feels true. And that word feel is really important. I put capital feels in our slide here. So FEELS capital, where it feels true that Jesus hears us, that he knows us and he understands us. And it feels true that I hear him, I know him, and I understand him. So Carl is talking about the science of attunement and attachment and how all that works. We want to use a memory. So you don't want to use a memory where it's like, hey, God really showed up. This was a great time, but it doesn't really feel like that when I think about it. You want to use a memory where it feels true that God heard me, he knows me, he understands me, and I can hear and know and understand him in that memory. Um, and I've done this with, I'm sure, hundreds of people. I've done this a lot. Oftentimes I'll hear someone say, I'm working with if I was working with someone and I could pick any age, right? So someone that's in their 40s, hey, can you ever think of a time where it really felt true that the Lord not just loved you, but he understood you and he knows you, and it felt true that you were hearing from him and you had that interactive connection. A lot of times people will say, when I was at my youth camp when I was a teenager, I remember this time when dot dot dot. So those are the memories that you want to use, and you want to use a memory that is, and it comes forward so often that it's important to probably just reference this. Is you don't want to use a mixed memory. So someone would say, I almost died and I was in the hospital, or my child had an issue where something happened and they were in the hospital, and it's really true. Oftentimes in those moments, you can hear or you can feel God's presence, or God will tell you a word that there's so much life on it. And my experience was, he said, I love you. I love your child. He's going to be fine. You're going to be fine. And it feels like I can really sense God in that presence, or I'm sorry, in that memory. So that's what we call a mixed memory, where there's so much good, but there also is the bad. There was the negative there too. So if you're working with a therapist or a practitioner who uses this, and you want to go back and you want to connect with Jesus and ask if there's lies in that, get all that taken care of, in the future, you could use that as a memory. That's that interactive connective memory, but you wouldn't start there. So going back to just that connection memory is any memory where it felt true that God connected with you. It can be as simple as last Sunday at church, there was a really good worship song. And so you would remember that. And you're going to use, and this, I'm not sure if this is Carl's words, but from sensory motor psychotherapy, we'd use the phrase state specific memory. So you're going to pull up that memory and you're going to say, where were you sitting? What did you see? Where were you standing? So the person might say, it was a really good worship song. It was that song about how he loves us. And I was standing, but then I actually just sat down and I had tears running down my face. And I just heard the Lord say, like if it's a woman talking, the Lord said, my daughter, I love you. And so that's the memory. And so you're going to picture the memory as though you were there. You're going to feel those warm tears go down your face. So you're going to be feeling that. You're going to be looking at the blue chairs in front of me. I see I'm 4 rows back and I can see the worship leader. You're going to pull up as much of that as you can. So that's how we work with the memory. And then that's that connective memory. So that's one type of memory we could use. There's a whole other area of memories that we could use, which is just appreciation memory. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean that you don't have a connection memory. It could be, I just want to use an appreciation memory. You can use either one of them. So this is any memory where there's a felt sense of thankfulness. So I was going for a walk and I was with my friend, and I just felt really connected and it was just a really good time. That's a perfect place. But you're still going to use state specific memory where so see if you can remember what that felt like to be walking. And oftentimes people, their eyes would be closed, and can you feel the left to right, the cadence of your walk, feeling the wind that's kind of blowing there. So you're going to, as much as you can, right, just recall that. And you're going to have a memory where there's that felt sense of thankfulness. So it doesn't have to be something huge for either the connection memory or the appreciation memory, but the more of the sense of thankfulness, the better, which will bring us to step 2. So again, step 1, identify a past memory and remember it. It's as simple as that. So this approach is so easy that we can complicate it. Just here's my past memory. Now I'm in it. That's step 1. Step 2 is just to thank God. And you want to be as specific as you can. Lord, thank you for the wind that's blowing in my hair as I'm walking with my friend. Thank you for that sense of I haven't seen him for 3 months, and just the sense of I'm hearing what's going on in his life. He's talking to me, and just how fun that is, and just the joy that's there. Thank you for that. And so I'm being as specific as I can as I'm thanking the Lord. The third step is, it sounds like this: Jesus, would you connect with me again here? Or Jesus, would you connect with me here? So you're making explicit requests to connect with Jesus. Um, I would say the word verbal is important here. When I'm working with people in my office, I oftentimes don't. I find that it's not as important. Other people might find something different, but it's not as important for me in my work to have them actually say thanking the Lord. I'm more looking for, can you feel that thankfulness? And then the third step is asking. So the explicit is to verbally ask him to connect with them. It's oftentimes isn't as effective if you think the thoughts, Jesus, would you connect with me? But specifically asking him. So that's the third step. And again, the step 2 and 3 happen really quick. So I'm in the memory. Step 2, thank Jesus. Step 3, connect with me. Can happen within 4 or 5 seconds. And then step 4 happens in the next 2 seconds. So it's like 4, 5, 6 seconds, the whole thing is just happening. So step 4 is speak out whatever comes into your awareness. And oftentimes this will be God speaking. So speaking pulls the material from the front of your brain to help you fully understand what God is communicating. So, I've had oftentimes, where if the person who does step 1, 2, and 3, and I'll say this about step 2. Step 2 is we offer specific thanksgiving to God. Psalms talks about how we enter his courts with thanksgiving. We enter into his courts with thanksgiving and his presence with praise. We enter his presence with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. There we go. And so, that is a gateway. Jesus is the mediator between God and man. He paid the price. Here's just stillness. I went into that in the last video with the Verkler's method, that stillness doesn't earn it. It's not, that is a technique that brings us to God. Jesus is the mediator. He is the connection. He paid a great price for us to have interactive connection with God. He paid the price. But Thanksgiving is like that stillness from the other approach, where if we thank God, that is the way that we enter his presence. So thanking him helps us to connect. Jesus is the gateway. Thanksgiving is not the gateway, but we enter the gateway. We enter into Jesus. Jesus is the gateway. Thanksgiving is not even the gateway. It's how we enter. We enter his presence with thanksgiving, and his gates with praise. So it's how we enter in. It helps bring us to him. Okay. So oftentimes I was saying, if we do 1, 2, and 3, when the person feels like they're not having a spontaneous connection with the Lord, it actually is. So if you'll speak out whatever comes into your awareness, it can be a really powerful thing. So someone is having a memory where they're we'll go back to where we were. You're walking with your friend. Thank you, Jesus, for this. Connect with me here. Maybe they're even thinking this isn't working, but if they just speak out, rather than saying it's not working, they're thinking it's not working. So in my office, I'll have the person say, so speak whatever's coming up. What are you remembering? Well, I'm remembering that there's just the blades of grass and the smell. I'm just aware of the smell of the grass. It's funny because when I say that, that's actually one of my favorite smells. And it reminds me of when I was little. If things were wrong or things just felt like they weren't okay, if I would just go outside, the smell of the freshly cut grass, even as I say it, it's almost like God is telling me, it's like his mercies are new every morning, just like the smell of that grass. So again, you're speaking out whatever comes into your awareness. And just by doing that, if you will be obedient with that, sometimes God will be speaking through that without you even knowing it. So that's the Emmanuel approach. We identify the memory, we enter it, we thank Jesus, we ask him to connect with us, we speak out whatever comes to our awareness. So not in the manual approach method, but if you go back to what we are talking about with the Verklers, so I learned the Verklers first. Like I said, 20 years ago, I learned a manual approach. I was doing the math probably about 8 years ago, 8.5 years ago, 9 maybe even. Um, it was a bit. There was just a website, and Carl Amen was in the process of developing it. But because I had learned, for 10, 11, 12 years before that, I'd been doing Mark Verkler's approach. There was times where I would speak things out, but you need another person there. Like, this is designed as a two-way thing. So you can use this yourself, either speaking it. Like I was in graduate school at the time. So I had a little MP3 recorder. I didn't even have a smartphone. So there's the date on it. You can do that. I also think it works for me just as well, just to write out. As long as you're not judging it, you could switch out speaking out to writing it out. So if I was doing this in a group at a church, this would be a place where we either get into groups of threes, if you're comfortable and you practice it, where one person would be the ones who would be doing the memory. The other one would be the one who would be like asking them questions, and just basically the one that you're going to speak things out to. And then one person would be the one observing. So you can do that. Another way you can practice it as a group, and this is probably my preferred way, is you just write out what comes out in step 4. So instead of speaking it out, you just write it out. So if you want to practice, you could pause the video here, go back to these steps, and practice it. All right, so we're going to go on to another subject here. So far we've talked about, going back to our first video, we've talked about the biopsychosocial spiritual model of care with listening, and how the window of tolerance is part of that biological piece where we're calming the body and just understanding the body itself. And then there's the psychological piece, which we're about to get into. And there's a social part, which is like the submitting what you're getting with other people, or in a manual approach, there's another person right there, oftentimes. So there's that social piece, and then the spiritual is, it's very spiritual. The Spirit of God is speaking to you. So hearing God's voice helps enhance basic psychological mental health skills also. All right, so we're going to talk about a basic understanding of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of a broad thing. So more of the cognitive piece of that. So this would be Beck's work. And I think a lot of times if someone comes to therapy and they're having depression or anxiety, this can be like a beginning, what someone might learn in the first 4 or 5 sessions of therapy. Works really well to help with anxiety and depression is a CBT, or a cognitive behavioral therapy approach. So we're just going to go through that. So we often think that our circumstances create our unpleasant emotions, such as depression and anxiety. But with this model, we become aware that it's not our circumstances that create the emotions, but our interpretation of the circumstances. It's our automatic thoughts that lead to emotions, behaviors, and physical sensations. So again, this is this model. Without going more into it, like, yes, there's more to mental health than this. This is a very crude or basic model. There's all kinds of stuff that comes up from other places. But at the same time, CBT is an evidence-based method that works really well. I think it's why a lot of times in therapy, people can start here and see how much that clears up. But this is that basic CBT model. All right. So let's look at this with cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a situation, and then we have emotions based off of that. So prior to therapy, people will say, I'm anxious right now because I am a college student and it's finals. And so I'm anxious about that. And then when you learn the CBT therapy basic technique, you start to learn that it's not the situation that causes the emotion or the anxiety. It's actually the story you're believing, or the thought or the belief that you're having about that is creating the emotion of the anxiety. So same situation of it's midterms and I'm really stressed out and I'm anxious, or it's finals and I'm anxious, and you learn that there's actually a thought or belief, or there's a story. So person's been studying really hard, keeping up with their studies, and they're still having the thoughts of I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail, I'm going to fail. And so we learn that the emotion of anxiety is coming from this automatic thought that just kind of comes up, or automatic distorted belief, we'll say with CBT. And the belief is I'm going to fail. And so what we do with CBT is we learn to change the belief, not necessarily with something that is like happy thoughts, because it's like your system is going to know that that's not true. You can't just go, I'm going to do great. I'm going to do great. Like that's probably not going to be the most helpful thing. But what we do is we find out if a thought is, the word is used, is distorted or not based on facts. So the facts of the situation is you've studied really hard. And so rather than have the thought, I'm going to fail, that's not based on truth. So we want to have a thought based on truth. So you tell yourself what is true. And the truth is I've studied hard, I'll do fine. Or I've studied hard, or every time I've studied hard, I've got A's and B's. So you come up with a thought, or like sometimes we might even say a mantra that you tell yourself over and over again. And with CBT, what we know is you can rewire the neural networks of your brain by telling yourself the truth over and over and over and over again. So kind of going into my work a little bit, I use a lot of EMDR. And how I'll explain EMDR in contrast to CBT is with EMDR, we can kind of go back to a core belief of where did you learn you're going to fail? And if we can go back to where that was learned, it doesn't take all the upkeep of telling yourself the truth over and over and over and over again. And so that's how like EMDR works. With cognitive behavioral therapy, we do know it's evidence-based. They've done tons of studies on it. It absolutely does work, and it's a lot of work. You're telling yourself the truth over and over and over again. And in doing that, you're rewiring your brain, and your emotions change. So here's some examples: situation, belief, emotion, hearing noise in the middle of the night. So someone wakes up and they have a noise in the middle of the night. And they have the emotion of fear, and they learn to say, what's the belief I'm having that's causing that? Oh, it's there's someone in my house. And this might go a lot faster, right? You wake up in the middle of the night and you're feeling fear, and you're like, man, why am I freaked out? And it's, oh, what if someone's in my house, or there's someone in my house? So same situation, that same person happens to remember, oh, there's a cat. I have a cat, and the cat makes noise, scratches at the screen. And so same situation, and you feel peace. So again, very simple understanding of things. But or a boss calls me into the office is a situation. I have a belief I did something wrong. That's why I'm anxious. Again, prior to therapy or prior to learning this CBT skill, I believe being called into my boss's office causes anxiety. But I start to realize it's actually this automatic belief that I did something wrong. That's what causes the anxiety. So if we're going to change our belief, and you're going to tell yourself the truth, something that's found on truth, and there's obviously a lot more to this skill than just this. This is a very crude, basic model. But if you tell yourself, I can do all things through Christ. So there's that Christian integration piece of CBT. I can do all things through Christ, and rather than anxiety, you might feel confidence, especially if you tell yourself that and you get used to telling yourself that truth. So using the word of God to change your emotions really is cognitive behavioral therapy. So standing on truth and telling yourself over and over again what God says is true in the written word of God. A lot of people, they do that. In fact, there's, I never want to say anything bad, but there's different streams of the body of Christ. There's a stream that really, like as a therapist, I'm not going to see them in my office very often because they really don't believe in therapy. And they've written all kinds of books about just using the Bible And the irony is they're probably using something pretty close to cognitive behavioral therapy to tell themselves the truth out of the Bible. So you don't have to use those phrases or that term, but with this is Aaron Beck's CBT model. There is more to it. You're learning to find out, look at situations and find facts versus just feelings is the thought. So here's some examples in scripture. Just for time, we're not going to go through it, but Israel's in the wilderness for 3 days. They think they're going to die, and so they have fear. So just showing that our situation, it's not that causes the anxiety, it's the belief we're having. So there's the story of Jesus walking on the water and Israel. If you want to go through that, you could pause the slide here and kind of just see some scriptural support of how our thoughts or our beliefs cause our emotions. Again, there's a lot more to how our emotions work. That's a very basic. There is emotions that come straight from situations, and it's worth saying that. All right, so and here's the purpose of showing this, is how does God's voice help with anxiety and depression with this CBT model? Or how does God, it could be any kind of mental health stuff. I'm lacking confidence and it's making me, I'm having issues where I'm coming to see a therapist. How can hearing God help with that? Well, if we go back to, I can change my thoughts and feel differently, then I can ask the Lord questions like, God, what's the lie I'm believing? Again, CBT is based on truth, not happy thoughts or wishful thinking. So we'll go back to where we were a couple of videos ago about, I have a neighbor who, when I go and take the trash out, hypothetical situation, if they aggressively come up to me and they're yelling at me and they always want to talk about political things that I don't have their same beliefs, and they're yelling at me, I can say, and it's happening every other day, I go out and I bring my trash out, and the same neighbor it's almost like they're waiting for me. So before I take the trash out, okay, the neighbor's going to be there. I'm feeling this anxiety. Lord, what's the lie? And it might be just the thought that comes to me from the voice of God, of the thought is you're a failure, or the thought is he hates you. So that would be the lie. Or the lie is you're doing something wrong. And so then you just ask Jesus, so what's the truth? And you can do this with the manual approach or Mark and Patty Verkler's 4 Keys to Hearing God's Voice. Remember that first part of the Verkler's method is becoming still. When we learn to use these skills as a daily part of our life, we can have a kind of inner stillness where we learn just to very quickly bring our heart to stillness and then hear truth within our heart. So you don't have to use all 4 of those steps on either one of the approaches. It could be just, God, what's the lie? Oh, I'm believing that I'm in danger, or I'm believing that I'm a failure. Jesus, what's the truth? And the truth is I'm loved. Or the truth is he's insecure. And so now I take out the trash and that same guy is, hey, blah, 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 blah. And he's yelling. And I'm sitting on this truth of, he's insecure. And what was intimidation and fear now becomes compassion and love. And, we change emotion with emotion. We change emotion with truth. So it's actually that truth that now I'm no longer in fear. I feel love rather than anxiety. So my listen with CBT. So yeah, just saying that there's that you could use a time from the last month with moderate anxiety, and you could just ask the Lord, God, what's the lie I'm believing here? So last month, what's a time where I felt some anxiety? What's the time I felt some depression? And if you want, you could pause here, or you could probably just ask really quick, in my heart, what am I sensing? What was the lie I was believing that was causing that panic or that anxiety or that depression or that feeling down? And then, God, what's the truth? it's knowing the truth. Sometimes people can say, okay, well, I renounce the lie. And even as, there's inner healing models that use that. It's really powerful, really good. You also just knowing the truth. The truth is going to shift you and you're going to move and your emotions will change. So that's how you can use hearing the Lord with CBT and with that CBT model of as just a skill. Because the key with cognitive behavioral therapy, like when I'm using that, I don't use a ton of that as a therapist, but when I do, I encourage people, I want you to learn this skill because I want you to become your own therapist. So in the moment when you're feeling anxious or depressed, I want you to learn the skill of being able to do this because I'm always trying to work myself out of a job and have you be able to say you don't need me anymore. So in the moment, what's the lie I was believing? What's the truth? That's something that you could even ask right now. So that's our hearing or listening to the Lord as a skill for mental health with that biopsychosocial spiritual model. Here are the references.